In this lab, we explored the two-dimensional motion of a mass oscillating on a spring and its simulated motion using GlowScript. The purpose of the lab was to use spring force, weight, kinetic energy, and potential energy to model and predict the motion of the mass attached to the spring. For models, we use Newton's second law, which implies that force is the product of mass and acceleration. We use these two formulae to find the spring force and force due to gravity. We also evaluated the potential and kinetic energy of the mass using these formulae. For systems and surroundings, the system included the earth, spring, the attachment point or the origin where the spring was fixed, and the mass of the bob attached to the spring itself. The surroundings were anything else that could have affected the system but were not considered, such as air, which provides drag. Briefly put, my simulation was able to predict the X motion quite decently but couldn't predict the Y position well enough. However, my simulation did predict that energy within a system is conserved, assuming no energy was lost to the surroundings, evident from the straight line. The main physics idea is that there are two forces acting on the mass, the force of the spring and the force of gravity. However, there is another force that separates our ideal GlowScript system from reality: drag or air resistance. Drag creates a dampening effect. Basically, the mass will oscillate lesser and lesser and eventually reach a state of rest because the system is constantly losing energy to drag. We will see this in detail in the results section later. Now I'll explain the procedures and the coding. In this experiment, we analyzed the motion of this oscillating mass on the tracker application. The tracker application gave us a table of data of X and Y positions relative to the origin, which was the attachment point. The objective was to create a visualization showing both the actual and the simulated motion of the mass. I'll explain the coding. Firstly, I made a slight modification to the procedure. I was struggling to make the code rely on a separate CSV file, so I directly hard-coded the data into the code itself, as seen by these two large arrays. In this part of the code, I declare all the details about the spring, such as the mass, the spring constant, the spring's relaxed length, and some other information like the value of g and the value of delta t for the simulation. I also declare things like the initial position of the ball. This section of the code has everything related to the energy of the system. I'm evaluating the initial states of the kinetic energy, gravitational potential energy, and spring potential energy here. In the next part of the code, I have a while loop in which the simulation runs for a total of 5.5 seconds. I keep evaluating the length of the spring. This is important to figure out how much the spring has compressed or stretched by, which is important to determine the force generated by it. Here, I'm iteratively figuring out the position of the mass by first using the force update, then the velocity update, and then the position update formulas. Keep in mind that this variable called dt physics is the same thing as delta t declared later, just expressed using a different variable name. These lines calculate the kinetic, gravitational potential, and spring potential energies along with the total energy. These lines graph these values onto energy time plots, which will be used for result analysis later. These lines plot the position of the ball onto the position time graphs as well. Finally, this block of code has everything to do with showing the actual motion of the mass which was recorded on tracker. Let's discuss the results. My simulation was able to track the X position of the ball quite well, but it struggled to predict the Y position of the ball. The simulation did predict that the change in the total energy of the system was zero, which was expected. Answering the two additional questions, the energy principle is satisfied by my model, as the change in total energy in the system is always zero. The period, as calculated from the X position graph, appears to be about 1.64 seconds, calculated by finding the wavelength of one wave. The period, as calculated from the Y position graph, appears to be shorter at 1.4 seconds though. There is clearly a difference, and this is because the mass is undergoing two types of motion. The mass acts both as a pendulum and a spring mass oscillator. So it makes sense that there are two different time periods because these two different types of motion are being combined into one. In terms of error, the biggest source of error is the fact that we are assuming that the system loses no energy, when in reality the system does lose energy to factors like drag. This creates a dampening effect wherein the amplitude of the swings gradually decrease over time until they are eventually zero. Also, it is worth mentioning that the predicted Y position and the actual Y position were different due to a difference that occurred here, where you can see two wavelengths in the red line where there should have been one. I am not too sure why this happened, but perhaps it's just due to the natural entropy which happens at times that can't be controlled.